All right, let's get right into it. Today, in this explainer, we're exploring something that is, honestly, absolutely fascinating. We're going to look at how chronic stress doesn't just make us feel mentally exhausted, but how it literally, physically rewires the biological architecture of our brains. I am incredibly excited to unpack this research with you because it completely shifts how we need to think about the physical impact of long-term stress on our mental health.
So we all know what stress feels like in the moment, right? You get that racing heart, maybe a tense jaw, that sudden rush of adrenaline. But I want you to take a second and think about what's actually happening on a microscopic level inside your head when that stress just doesn't turn off, when it becomes this persistent, inescapable background noise in your life. How exactly does chronic stress physically change our brains at the cellular and even the genetic level? Well, to answer that, we have to zero in on a really vital piece of our neuroanatomy, the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC for short. Think of the PFC as your brain's command and control center. It's in charge of emotional processing, higher-level cognition, and regulating your attention and behavior. But here's the catch. This specific region of the brain is incredibly sensitive and highly vulnerable to stress. That makes it the absolute perfect starting point for us to understand the physical roots of mental health challenges.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the weight of chronic stress. Second, decoding the brain's blueprint. Third, the glial support collapse. Fourth, the suppressed neural spark. And finally, bridging mice and men.
Okay, part one, the weight of chronic stress. Before we dive into the deep genetics, we really need to ground this science in everyday reality. Look, acute, short-term stress isn't actually a bad thing. A little spike in our stress system is biologically necessary. It keeps us alive. But chronic stress, that's a totally different beast. It pushes your biological system way past its ability to just bounce back to normal. It creates what scientists call a dangerously high allostatic load. Basically, over time, this heavy biological burden leads to real structural alterations in the brain, like the actual shrinking of neural branches in the PFC. And this causes very real cognitive impairment, acting as a massive risk factor for severe conditions like major depressive disorder and PTSD. It is a profound physical weight on the body. Moving on to part two, decoding the brain's blueprint. So how do researchers actually decode the exact genetic fingerprint of this kind of stress? Well, they play detective. They conducted a massive, highly rigorous meta-analysis. They didn't just look at one isolated one-off study. No, they pulled from 6 distinct, publicly available data sets, compiling a really robust sample of 117 mice. And they specifically focused on 2 highly validated behavioral models, chronic social defeat stress and chronic unpredictable mild stress. By combining these different paradigms, they were basically able to strip away all the random noise from individual labs and isolate the true underlying biological effects of chronic stress.
And the core concept they were investigating here is the transcriptome. Think of the transcriptome as the brain's active working instruction manual. By taking genetic material from the prefrontal cortex of these stressed mice, the researchers could sequence the RNA. This let them see exactly which genetic instructions the brain was actively reading and which ones it was basically tossing in the trash, all as a direct response to chronic stress.
And that leads us to an absolutely crucial number, 133. Out of over 21,000 genes they analyzed, they found exactly 133 genes that were consistently, significantly altered across all of these different studies. It didn't even matter what specific type of chronic stress the mice were facing. These 133 genes always changed their behavior. This right here is a definitive, universal biological signature of chronic stress.
Which brings us to part three, the glial support collapse.
So what are those 133 genes actually responsible for? Well, the data reveals a massive, consistent failure in the brain support networks. Across multiple independent labs, researchers saw a really robust downregulation or a severe suppression of specific genes. We're talking about genes like AQ4, THA2H, and S100B. Now, these aren't your primary signaling neurons. These are markers for your glial cells, specifically astrocytes and oligodendrocytes, as well as the blood vessels in your brain.
To translate that complex biology into plain English, when chronic stress hits, it actively shuts down the brain's plumbing and its insulation. Seriously. For example, that AQP4 gene, it builds a water channel protein that's critical for the blood-brain barrier and flushing out waste. That's your plumbing. And genes like FA2H are essential for making the myelin sheath, which is the vital protective insulation wrapped around your nerve fibers. Under chronic stress, the genetic instructions needed to maintain these crucial support systems are literally turned down. The entire structural foundation of the prefrontal cortex just weakens.
All right, part 4, the suppressed neural spark.
So we know the support staff is collapsing, but what happens to the primary neurons themselves? Once again, the researchers found a very consistent downregulation, but this time in a totally different class of genes, called immediate early genes, or IEGs. We're looking at genes like FOS, JUNB, and ARC. These genes are essentially the first responders of your neural network. They are absolutely critical for rapid neural activity and synaptic plasticity, which is just the brain's ability to adapt, learn, and form new connections.
This sets up a really fascinating, but kind of scary contrast between a healthy brain and a chronically stressed one. In a normal brain, when you hit a sudden stressor, these immediate early genes spike. They light up fast, sparking the neuroplasticity you need to react to a sudden threat. But with chronic stress, when the stress is just inescapable and constant, those exact same genes are persistently suppressed. The whole baseline response is just muted. The chronically stressed brain literally loses its molecular spark and its ability to be flexible.
And finally, part 5, bridging mice and men.
Now you might be thinking, okay, this is all happening in mice, but what about us? Well, when the researchers compared their 133 gene signature to massive databases of actual human brain tissue, they found a remarkable convergence. The specific genetic changes, like the loss of that glial support and the suppression of the neural spark found in the prefrontal cortex of chronically stressed mice, strongly correlate with the transcriptomic data mapped from human brains suffering from severe psychiatric illnesses.
We honestly cannot overstate how profound this connection is. The exact genetic blueprint of chronic stress identified in these animal models overlaps significantly with gene activity patterns seen in severe human conditions. We're talking about major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, alcohol abuse disorder, PTSD, and even in the brain tissue of suicide victims. The physical, microscopic damage caused by inescapable stress is a universal thread running right through our most devastating psychiatric disorders.
So, to summarize the core scientific takeaway right from the researchers themselves, our study demonstrates that chronic stress induces a robust, cross-paradigm PFC signature, characterized by downregulation of glia/myelin and vascular pathways and suppression of immediate early gene activity. In short, chronic stress creates a universal genetic fingerprint of dysfunction in the brain. It turns off the insulation, it turns off the plumbing, and it suppresses the neural spark.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to wrap up on. If we now know the exact genetic blueprint of chronic stress, if we can actually pinpoint these exact 133 genes that rewrite the brain's architecture, could we one day use this instruction manual to build completely new, highly targeted treatments? Could we actually find a way to switch the insulation and the neural spark back on and physically protect the mind from mental illness? It is an incredibly exciting frontier in neuroscience. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to never stop questioning the fascinating science of the brain.